All right, and actually, I was just told that Mr. Dotson just pulled up, so we'll go ahead and get started. Well, good morning, everyone. This is Jomo Stewart here at the Fairbanks Economic Development Corporation. So good to have everyone online. Today is, force of habit, Wednesday, February 24th, 9 o'clock in the a.m. For a special presentation from, the Alaska Energy Authority regarding the Susitna-Watana Hydroelectric Project and an update regarding that project. If you recall, last Tuesday in our discussions regarding the Alaska gas line, the Susitna Dam project came up as a point of brief discussion. And so I went ahead and reached out to Executive Director Thayer to see if we could get an update regarding that project. And so I believe we do have online, again, Mr. Thayer, Mr. Brian Carey, I saw Kirk Warren. So several members of AEA have generously given us their time today. And so we'll just go ahead and get started. Mr. Thayer, may I go ahead and hand it over to you?
All right, fair enough. Thank you very much. I have to admit, I might be a little gun shy here with Gary and Steve in the room, understanding of their involvement with ADA and my predecessor to Steve in my current role. But a little bit about AEA, I think, first to kind of set the stage here, and that is what we do. And one of those things is we do railroad energy. That is from Bradley Lake all the way to Fairbanks. That involves the ownership by AEA of the Bradley Hydro Project. And Golden Valley receives about 17% of its power, 17% of the power from Bradley Lake. Let me rephrase that, not their total power, but 17% of the power produced at Bradley Lake. We just recently completed a $47 million diversion project at Battle Creek to put more energy into the lake. And we're constantly looking at ways to streamline.
Yes, you did, dear. So when you came out there to the garage with me and we cut my scissors,
Mr. Thayer, do you mind? May I please ask everyone to go ahead and mute themselves? And actually, I guess I'll give the usual technical announcement. The chat line will be open. I'll be monitoring that for questions. However, you can feel free to unmute yourselves if you do have a question. Mr. Thayer is an old hand with this group. But again, if you're just coming online, please go ahead and mute yourselves. Sorry, Mr. Thayer, please do proceed.
Okay, fair enough. And so with the Bradley, one of the things that we've recently done is work with the 5 northern utilities, or really, I guess 4 northern utilities now that Miscellaneous Power has been purchased. And that is to purchase the SSQ line from Sterling to Quartz Creek. That will allow us to start to upgrade the line, and also it ends years of lawsuits among the utilities and Homer Electric. And that's going to just be a benefit, obviously, to the consumers by ending the lawsuits and being able to move forward on a series of upgrades. AEA also owns the transmission line from Willow to Healy, and that actually saves Golden Valley Electric about $40 million in costs by being able to purchase power cheaper, some power cheaper in the market in Anchorage, and transfer to Fairbanks. Another project that we also have is we do rural energy. We construct bulk fuel tank farms as well as diesel powerhouses for electrical distribution of grids in rural Alaska. There's about 197 communities that we focus on. Of that, there's a subset of about 50 that do not have a local utility tied with them. And they're the smallest communities. They could be, majority of these communities are under 2,000 people, but the majority of these small ones are 100 to 200 people. And so we do definitely focus on those 50 that do not have any other support other than AEA. We also run the Power Cost Equalization Program, which is an endowment of, and the earnings off the endowment is, I'm just trying to, oh, sorry, I was reading the screen as I was talking. Apologize for that. What there is, there's an endowment of $1.1 billion for power cost equalization. There's a formula based on the earnings, but the first set of earnings comes off of that, pays for power cost equalization. The second goes into community assistance, and the third comes back into a renewable energy fund back into AEA if the earnings are sufficient. This particular year, there's sufficient for PCE and a little bit of the community assistance, but the earnings are down actually on that fund. And one thing to keep in mind, it is considered a subsidy into rural Alaska, but at the same time, where rural Alaska doesn't have the infrastructure that has been built by the state over the years, whether that be Bradley or the Intertie or gas credits or various incentives for energy costs. So it is a balance. We also are working on renewable energy. That's one of the things we continue to do with Bradley, it being a state-owned facility and not having some of the environmental issues around it. We're looking at ways that we can continue to expand that opportunity. One of the things that we do know is we're going to have to improve the transmission lines. Only in government can you build a 120 megawatt power plant and serve it by 75 megawatt lines. Of course, the lines came first, but needless to say, they need to be upgraded. We also do a series of grants and loans, grants through the Renewable Energy Fund, and then our loan portfolio is our power cost, or our power fund, our PPF. That's heavily invested throughout Alaska. Our largest is down in Southeast Alaska. We have $20 million invested in Haida Energy, or on Halungnai, which is on Prince of Wales Island, which just actually was completed this fall and is now producing power. We're a banker in that regard, not an owner. And we kind of prefer to do that through our PPF loan fund. We've done the solar farm. We've done a solar farm in Willow. We did the cogeneration plant down here with our senior center, and in Fairbanks, we also have the wind farm out in Delta that we help finance. And then in addition to that, we do energy planning and in collaboration with local and regional partners. And I think one of those in particular is there's a cold storage facility being built at the Anchorage International Airport. And we were successful in a build grant from the US DOT for $21 million to help make that project happen. And that is primarily for energy efficiency and renewable technology on that building as it's being constructed. But it's going to be close to several 100,000 square feet, so quite a project. So with that, I just want to kind of give you a baseline, a little bit about AEA and some of the projects that we have ongoing. And for today's presentation, there's been a lot of interest in Susitna-Watana. And we can go to the next slide.
Actually, sir, if you don't mind, before you go, you just opened yourself up to this. It's been a while since we had a true update and deep dive on power cost equalization. I also saw in the legislative docket, there's a bill, I believe it was actually introduced on behalf of the governor regarding the Renewable Energy Fund. And now you've just mentioned cold storage. So I guess the short answer, sir, is we'll be circling around, if we may, to get a little bit more information on a number of things that AEA is up to. You guys always do just an enormous amount of very interesting and very good work.
Not a problem. I'm open to all questions, and if I can, I'll punt them to Brian on whatever issue.
Okay, well, thank you.
So Susitna-Watana, and let me preference this presentation by the fact that in 2000, well, why don't we go to the next slide? In 2014, a lot of work was done on Susitna-Watana prior to 2014. AEA was successful in getting 2/3 of the way through the licensing process through FERC, spending $193 million. The legislation to support Susitna-Watana, which put it in statute and it fell to AEA, was unanimously approved by the legislature. That being said, in 2014, Governor Walker, with Administrative AO 271, placed the Susitna-Watana Hydro Project in abeyance. And in 2019, Governor Dunleavy with AO 309 rescinded AO 271. And there has been no state funds spent since 2015 going forward on the Susitna-Watana project. There's been a lot of interest of late on the project, not only from Alaskans, but from the utilities, but from outside companies. Companies that in some cases would like to do business and have access to the cheap power the Susitna-Watana could potentially bring, and some for actually owning and constructing the project. So there's been a various interest on that. But again, we've not spent any significant state funds on it in fiscal year 2020. So this presentation, a lot of it goes back to the numbers we have in 2014 and 15. As we have is HB 306 was passed and set the aspirational goal to generate 50% of the state's electricity from renewables and alternative energy sources by 2025. We are not at that point right now. We've probably since 2010, we've moved the needle about 9% up on the scale. Primarily that has to do with some of the work at Bradley. That also includes Kodiak going almost 100% renewable. So that has helped move the needle. And of course, we have projects like Hawaii that's in the process. So that's going to move the needle. If a project like Susitna-Watana was to come online, that would jump right now probably to well over 60% of the state's electricity and renewables will be coming from Susitna, but it would jump up to 60% for the state's needs. Next slide, please.
Sorry, I was on mute. If I may,
yeah.
So the numbers you just put out, those include, again, renewables being used by the different co-ops around the state?
Correct.
Things like the GBA's wind farm?
Correct. Okay.
And so where did you say we stand right now on a statewide basis regarding renewables?
Next slide.
Yes, sir. Okay. Thank you.
So we moved up from 21 in 2019 to 27, and we're most likely right around 29% right now, as we've had some of the other hydro projects come online in the state, like I said, in the southeast and along 9. But it kind of gives you a perspective. And again, with Susitna-Watana, we will jump from 27 to over 60% almost overnight once that was become operational. So it can be done. We did fund, like I said, we funded a solar farm that sells into the MEA system, but that's about 1.4 gigabytes, I think, or megawatts. So they're not large projects, but there are small projects coming in across the state, which slowly is moving the needle up. But Susitna-Watana, quite frankly, is the single largest to jump us to that 50 plus number.
And it does have the benefit of being able to act as base load power, correct?
Correct. You know, one of the conversations that we are having that I've recently had, and that is re-engaging the electrical utilities to find out if there's an interest to pursue Susitna-Watana. There was a lot of gas generation built in South Central Alaska over the last 10 years. And so that's been kind of it's kind of been a concern. Are we overloading the market, and do they still support Susitna-Watana? And all the utilities continue to support Susitna-Watana and going into the licensing, because a lot of these gas generation, by the time they've been built and by the time you go through permitting and you actually build Susitna-Watana, you're probably looking at a good 15 years on being very optimistic, and maybe up to 20. And they're already been in existence for 10. So they're going to be a depreciated asset. And so, and then everybody is moving more towards renewable energy. Utility boards have their internal goals for a utility debt. And my understanding from some of the boards, the board goals for individual utilities, Susitna-Watana would hit that mark for them. So there's interest from the utilities in that regard.
Do we have any further questions while we're paused? Okay. As a reminder, you may take yourself off mute if you do, or you may enter it into the chat box.
Yeah, this is Lisa Barra. Yeah, I have a question. It's
Go ahead,
Lisa.
Lisa.
Yeah, I was starting to type it, but you'd move on by the time I finished typing, so I'll just ask. Yeah, I'm a little bit confused by this and recognizing that this graphic and recognizing these data are a bit old. You know, I may not include a lot of the in-stream and maybe off the road system, off the, you know, rail belt system, use of other energies. And if you can just explain this a little bit more, if I'm reading this correctly, looking at say 2019, it's 27% hydro and 2.5% other renewables. So that's close to 30% renewables statewide. Or is that just rail belt wide? And then what your statement is that if the Susitna Dam comes online, that's going to double from 30% to 60%. Can you clarify that, please?
Well, first of all, this, when you look at the slide, we have the wind, solar, and biomass. We've seen an increase of about 2.5% from 2011 to 2010. Hydro has gone up about 6%. What this does not take into account is some of the hydro projects in Southeast Alaska, such as Halongai, that has come online. So this does take into account not just the rail belt, but as a statewide goal. In doing that, Brian Carey is our manager of owned assets, and he was on the Susitna-Watana project. So Brian, do you have anything to add?
Okay, a couple of things in regards to, yes, there has been a bunch of small hydros, in-stream type ones that have come online in the last couple of years. The total amount of energy they produce is actually on the low side because it might be large for a village, but compared to the rail belt, it's not large. And so we still have it where the two largest hydros in the state, Bradley and Snettisham, are producing about 45% of the hydro energy in the state. And in the case of Susitna, if you bring Susitna online, I believe that will probably increase the renewables by at least 35%. So, you know, if the 2019 is showing as being around 30%, Susitna will push the statewide electrical generation by renewables up to probably up in the area around 65%.
And I don't know if I'd be asking this question correctly, but I'll put it out. And is that as far as like installed capacity as opposed to, you know, full like use as percentage of total power produced by, say, a GBEA?
The installed capacity for the stored hydros in Alaska tends to be a much higher capacity than what your average energy would be from the plant. So in the case of, if you have a thermal plant and you have a 60 megawatt generator and you run it lots of times maybe around 50 megawatts. So from that standpoint, you could say that you're using a high efficiency. But the storage hydros in Alaska, such as Bradley or Snettisham, you tend to have a high capacity and a lower annual energy. So Bradley installed is 120 megawatts. But if you look at the amount of energy produced over the year, it averages out to a number of about 40 or 45 megawatts. And so you could say that from that standpoint on the hydro, it's only a third efficiency of it. It's not really efficiency of how effective the generators are, but you have to have a large capacity with storage hydro to be able to handle the storms and the snow melt amounts when you have a lot of water.
Okay. And actually, I was thinking more along the lines of, say, a wind farm, where if the wind was blowing constantly at a certain rate, you'd have this much generation. But of course, it's intermittent and it may not be up to full capacity even when the wind is blowing. That's, I guess, really, I'm wondering if our goal is to have enough, you know, say 50% of our capacity being able to be fulfilled by renewables if everything was working right, or up to full usage, or if we're really talking about like actually utilizing 50% of the power we would use would be coming from renewables.
Yeah, and the wind farms you've got, they're again the same average energy versus capacity, so that much of the wind farms around here might be 30 or 35%. of what the rated capacity is. And so when you look at it's different between what the average, well, the 30% of the energy for the rail belt versus 30% of the capacity. If it's 30% of the capacity, then the wind farms and storage hydros will tend to have a large number of capacity and not as high of an energy number. So there's a bit of a difference between the renewables and the gas generation of capacity versus energy.
Okay, thank you. Didn't mean to get too down in the weeds.
Oh, not a problem, not a problem. On the next slide, as I previously mentioned, that a state statute gives the power and the authority to acquire the Susitna project, whether by construction, purchase, purchase, gift, or lease, and to perform the feasibility studies and engineering design with respect to the power projects. Of course, with that authority also needs to come funding for that. And like I said, there's been no funding for the project since approximately 2014. Why Susitna-Watana? 50% of the railroad energy demands we met. It allows us for greater winter storage capacity, lower overall cost to develop. I'm sorry, we're on the next slide. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Sorry. It's a less complex project, and there's kind of fewer long-term operational uncertainties. And we expect this to be a stable, reliable, clean energy for 100 years. And in this picture, actually reflects somewhat what the dam would look like. The project history, which is the next slide. We have been studying the Susitna-Watana project for, I think it's safe to say, 70 years. In 1980 and 1950, there was the first studies conducted by the U.S. federal government. Then the state of Alaska studied the project in the 80s, and the oil price caused it to be postponed. The goal was set in 2010 of the renewable at 50%. And then again, in 2011, the legislature unanimously authorized moving ahead on the Susitna-Watana project. Studies began the following year, and again, that was $193 million worth of studies. And then the license was put into abeyance, and I should say, Governor Walker put it into abeyance, and then it came out again, like I said, in 2019 with Governor Dunleavy. But so far, the governor's office, the governor or the administration has not moved it forward beyond taking it out of abeyance. And again, we're having conversations with the local utilities and such to make sure there's interest in it. But again, it hasn't been a green lighted project. There's a lot of interest in the project. There's a lot of interest, like I said, from outside, but also within the legislature. I think one of the challenges that we have, and this is not to be a political statement, but we've had a lot of change and turnover in the legislature in the last 10 years, including 9 new freshmen this year in the legislature. And with that, you lose a lot of historical reference with certain legislators. Some of the greatest champions of the Susitna project have left the legislature, and there are new ones forming, but they just don't have the depth and experience of the years past on the history of this project. And so with that, there's a steep learning curve with the legislature that we are undertaking just to answer their questions. I'll let the next slide, Brian, if you want to take the next slide on the mapping and the direction of it.
Okay, this location of where the Susitna-Watana project would be is about 187 miles from Tidewater. Significantly, it is above the Devil's Canyon section of the Susitna River. And the reason why it's significant is Devil's Canyon serves as a barrier to the salmon. And so we actually, the one year, did look up sonar at the project site. And during July, when there was extremely low water levels of about 10th percentile, there was a couple of salmon that could make it up to king salmon. But aside from that, under normal flows, other salmon cannot. And under normal flows, probably most years, the king salmon can't make it up there. And so it is upstream of a significant fisheries barrier. It tends to have, very silty water. And of the fish the salmon that go into the Susitna River, I believe it's around 97% of the salmon that enter in at the mouth will go up side rivers such as the Talkeetna River and Portage Creek and Chilliwack River and those type rivers. And the basin area that it's drawing from goes all the way from the Alaska Range to the Talkeetnas, which gives it a large area in case of variability from rains. And it has a glacial component of the water of, I think 5 to 10% is what's coming out of the Alaska Range.
This Devil Canyon barrier that you're referencing, where would that be relative to the yellow, blue, or red lines?
It's part of the blue line. And so you see in the middle of the figure that shows where Chilliwack is, and just go upstream a little bit from Chilliwack on the blue line. Yeah, you've got your arrow there. And if you go just a tad upstream of it, that's where the Devil Canyon is. That's about where the start of Devil's Canyon is. And it was looked at that you could do a run of river at Devil's Canyon, but the downside for the utilities is while you could produce quite a lot of energy, you would not have the storage amount at Devil's Canyon. And so you'd have a lot of energy during the summer when you don't necessarily need it, and you would not have the large energy during the winter time when you really wanted it.
Okay. Are there any questions at this moment? Okay. Thank you, sir.
Okay, so just project at the glance, it doesn't specify here, but the dam would actually be made out of roller compacted concrete, which is a relatively new technology during the last 20 years. Most of the large concrete dams around the world, and the leading one on large concrete dams is actually probably China, has been using the roller compacted concrete because you can put up large concrete dams in a big hurry. And we list the height as 705 feet, and that's from the assumed bedrock level. And so if you're to look at it from river level, it's about 600 feet tall instead of 700 feet tall. The reservoir length, approximately 42 miles. The installed capacity, 459 megawatts, is at the average reservoir level. The reservoir would have 200 feet of drawdown. And so the 459 megawatt output would be if you're drawn down 100 feet. But when the reservoir is at full pool, it'd be actually up over 600 megawatts output. And annual energy, 2,800 gigawatt hours. The rail belt area is probably around 5,000. So the amount of energy that would come out of Susitna would be 50 to 60% of the rail belt energy as a guess on it. And the cost is, we haven't updated the cost estimate since 2014, but with the 50 percentile cost estimate was the 5.65 billion.
Okay, do we have any questions at this moment? Okay, just a reminder that I am controlling the slides. We can always flip back and forth if you have a question that came from a slide that we passed.
Okay, on the figure here shows what was taken from an animation shot on terms of computers. On the left side of it is the quarry where all the rock has been mined, and we've done test borings to know that the rock would be good quality for the use of the roller compacted concrete. And up on the far right-hand side is where a substation would be. It's roller compacted concrete, as mentioned before. You can see in the middle of it is where you've got 3 pin stocks going down to the powerhouse at sea level. On the near side is where the spillway would be in case if you need to release extra water. And during construction, the ground that's closest to you is where there would be a diversion tunnel that would go through. You divert the river through the diversion tunnel during construction. And then once construction was done, you would be able to use some of the diversion tunnel as an emergency spillway if needed be at a future time. So the size and generation, you can always build it higher or lower, but there's a lot of fixed cost involved on the construction. So from that standpoint, we came up with this elevation on the basis of the ProMod work with the utilities in terms of what they needed for generation. Certainly some of the seismic type work and probable maximum flood information went through a board of consultants with FERC. And so the board of consultants was pleased in regards to what we were looking at for the flood design and the maximum credible earthquake. We have a lot of seismograph information from that area, and we've probably done more seismic studies for Susitna than anywhere else has been done up here in the last, decades worth of work. And ended up with a culmination of the 2014 engineering feasibility report, which gave quite a lot of information in regards to all the drilling activity there, all the seismic work, and all the modeling work that would occur on the dam.
If I might, sir. So my frame of reference regarding large dams, of course, is the Hoover Dam, of which I've seen lots of History Channel specials. What is the difference between, say, the way that Hoover Dam was constructed and this roller compacted concrete?
Yeah, the roller compacted concrete, a couple of things you use. They actually, you can put it together very quickly with a variety of equipment. So instead of doing a whole bunch of pouring of different, I'll say molds, you could actually transport the concrete by dump truck onto the dam and just dump it off the dump truck, which is what they do in other countries, say in Africa. And so it's really forgiving from that standpoint. They do a 10-foot lift all the way across the dam. And then within a day or two, then they're able to be just driving right on top of that and putting a new lift on top of it. And so it's very much a continuous project. They use fly ash from coal plants to strengthen up the concrete. And it also tends to be, if I remember correctly, not as hot. And one of the problems with Hoover Dam is when you pour the large masses of concrete, you need to be cooling that concrete as you do it. And on a large concrete structure like this, that's a very significant problem. But the roller compacted concrete is not near as hot. And so you could do it with less cooling, and you can lay it down much quicker than what you can with conventional concrete.
So I guess, well, two comments, if I may. Well, one's a comment. It's good to hear that we might be able to use some of that fly ash, again, what is generally considered a waste product that we have to kind of fret to figure out how we're going to get rid of, the fly ash from the coal plants that could be used as the aggregate. So that's good.
Yes. Yes.
I guess my only question would be, has this kind of construction been done in a place that has the same kind of seismic profile that we have here in Alaska?
Yes, it has. I mentioned earlier about China. China has actually a bunch of dams, which are concrete dams, which are greater than 500 feet. And so about 10 years ago, they had some large earthquakes over there that was around magnitude 8. And in some cases, the epicenter was only 10 miles away from a 500 to 600 foot tall RCC concrete dam. And there was essentially no damage to the dam. They had, some boulders come down and hit the powerhouse or otherwise. But during the earthquakes in Sichuan about 10 years ago, which were magnitude 8, the concrete dams were very close by, very large dams, and they really did not receive damage to the dam.
That is nice to hear. We do have one question in the chat box regarding the total amount of cement using this kind of construction method and also lower total cement content.
The total cement content, I think the total cement content stays about the same because the amount of fly ash, you don't need to add that much fly ash before you can change the properties to what you want. And so you still end up using about the same amount of cement that you would otherwise. And somehow I'm jumping in my mind of, it's, I'd have to look back at just what the quantity of cement was on the calculations. It's a large quantity.
It's okay. Thank you. One of the things we have discussed here in this group before, we all know that we use a lot of cement up here. We also know it's energy intensive to make cement, but just beyond that, it costs a lot to get it all here. That we have a lot of the components we might use to make cement right here in the state of Alaska. This might be both an alternative driver for starting to utilize those resources, but also to create the power to be able on a more of a clean green basis make concrete, or at least the active material, reactive material for concrete. But that's another subject. Okay, thank you. Do we have any further questions on this slide? And thank you all so much for your level of detail.
Okay, employment opportunities we're showing is based on what the estimates were during construction. There was first prior to construction during the licensing phase and the studies. Yeah.
Sorry, we jumped ahead of the slide.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No,
Sorry.
we did it. It was on us.
Yeah.
Please go forward.
Okay, the economics. So I mentioned earlier that we did a bunch of the ProMod studies with the utilities to take a look at what the cost of energy would be. From the ProMod type work, we, on terms of the utilities, came up with the positive benefit cost ratio of over 2 from the energy savings. That did not include savings to the utilities on terms of avoided capital cost expenditures in terms of replacing their natural gas or otherwise power plants. And so I guess that's an important part about that in terms of it's the 2.39 was a conservative benefit cost ratio based on how natural gas and otherwise was escalating and the future plans for replacement of their natural gas generation units. Okay.
We did have a question in the chat box. Are you or will you be marketed? Well, I guess I should just ask, did this explanation or this slide cover this question? Actually, I'll just go ahead and read it. I believe it may have. Are you or will you be marketing the expected costs and benefits to the utilities to gain them as advocates or supporters? And it sounds like the answer was yes.
This is Curtis. The short answer is yes. This project cannot go forward without the support of the local utilities because they are base load. And in our conversations with them recently, as in last month, they are still supportive of the project. Of course, the devil's in the details as there has to be a lot of analysis updated, cost benefit analysis that needs to be updated, what that cost of power might be. But again, this would not go forward without the support of the utilities.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so employment I mentioned early on that the pre-construction employment, 5,000 direct jobs. We're already into that, or we used up some of those jobs already a couple of years ago, but there's still be a lot more work to do in regards to the studies, both the environmental and the economic and the engineering type studies prior to work. The indirect jobs is actually showing just the multiplier effect of what that spending would do in Alaska. Construction employment, that's over a time period of, I believe 9 to 11 years. would be what the construction would occur. And so at any one year, most of the years, you'd have perhaps 1,000 people being directly employed during construction. And then there'd be various indirect jobs that are supporting the construction work that's not out of the site-wise. So once you get the project constructed, there's actually not a real lot of jobs associated at the project site directly. So you may have on-site anywhere from 20 to 30 people on-site, just almost like a small community doing small operations and maintenance type work, and be dispatched out of one of the utilities elsewhere.
So could you repeat that as far as the total construction timeline? That's rather lengthy.
It actually shows up as being 9 to 11 years. And on the construction timeline, a bunch of that's actually not the dam construction. As soon as you get the okay from FERC to proceed forward, you've got to get access to the site. And so going in to build the road to get access, that's going to spend close to 2 years getting that road in before you could really start hauling the heavy equipment and materials in that you need. And so that adds on to that time period. Once you get to the site, the next part you need to be doing is, of course, along with bridging the Susitna River so you can have men and materials going back and forth across the river, you need to be constructing the diversion tunnel, which is, it's popping in my mind about a 40-foot diameter or more large tunnel that goes around the project site. So that's a huge tunnel that you've got to be able to excavate. And once you've done it, which you'd be doing at sea level, at river level, then you'll put in your cofferdams, one above where the dam site is going to go in, and one below. And so that you can divert the river into the diversion tunnel and dewater the area where the dam is going to go. And all that work to do the diversion tunnel and the cofferdams, there again is close to 2 years. And so by the time you actually start working on excavating down to bedrock and start building up from there your big concrete dam, the concrete dam may be about 5 years that actually puts together, but it's all that work for the initial access and diversion, which is actually increasing the timeline wise. It may be able to be shortened in some ways, depending on, one is with the passage of time, there may be changes in access, and also there could be decisions made to do other work in parallel with each other. And so that instead of being sequential with the parallel, you may be able to shorten time, but it just depends on what ones want to do in terms of cost wise. Sometimes it's going to be more expensive to do it in parallel, even though it speeds the time period.
Understood. Thank you. Do we have anyone else? Okay.
Okay. So at the point that the studies were stopped, AEA was about 2/3 of the way through the integrated license process. There's 58 approved studies that we were doing. Most of those studies, probably at least 50 of those, had to do with environmental type studies. And then only about 10 of them had to do with engineering type studies. Of those studies, maybe 1/3 of those were completed, and the other 2/3 were, we had information for the initial study report that was filed with FERC, but we did not have, I don't believe we had the study determination from them. But from that standpoint, we need to finish up a couple of those 39 studies and relatively environmental studies. And at that point, we should be done with the studies, because there was other studies that were requested by agencies that we collect more information, or study modifications by agencies. And pretty much in about every case, or nearly every case, when that went to FERC, FERC did not modify the studies. And so, at the point that was let off FERC was quite happy with the way the studies were going, and we're pushing back any changes to studies. Okay.
Oh, I think you may have covered some of this with your last comments. Okay.
And project timeline too.
Yeah, and so the timeline wise, it shows we're in the pre-application phase, and once you get the license from FERC, then at that point, you're not able to necessarily immediately go ahead and construct. You're able to, they will put various conditions or other information they need. So they may say, well, at the point you have your license, you will not necessarily be finished with what your design is finished. And so they'll put information in there that says that you need to finish up your design. It has to go through FERC, be approved by them for design. You have to show that you've got site control and funding and various other things like that. But at least once you have your license, you've shown to anyone that you've pretty much done with the environmental type review. And so that's kind of more of a major milestone with the environmental standpoint of the license.
Okay, and then our last slide, the last slide really, this is the governor and the legislature decides the next steps. If green lighted, definitely we need to do what I call a stage gate approach in determining the licensing status. We've got to update cost estimates and obtain the license, update the benefit cost economic impact analysis, review data to make sure it's still current. Changes in technology might affect the price of the dam. Same thing when we look at the cost benefit. The cost of borrowing money now is a lot cheaper than it was in 2014. We also need to consult with FERC, landowners, and other stakeholders, and not necessarily in this order. These are some of the next steps that the governor is contemplating, as well as members of the legislature, to decide where we need to be. To put a little bit in context for cost, currently Bradley Lake spends was about 4 to 4.5 cents a kilowatt, where you have natural gas is closer to 8.5, 9 cents on the rail belt, and growing just as gas is depleted and the cost of those contracts are going higher. And at this time, at the time this was done, Susitna-Watana fell around the 6 cent mark. And that's really the question. If the costs now are pushing up against natural gas, it's not really cost effective. If it's 6 cents or lower, then you probably have a doable project. But again, we've got to determine these things first, and the cost estimate is a huge one to determine if it is worth going forward. And with that, I think Brian and I are open for whatever questions, not only on Susitna or about AEA in general.
Okay, well, thank you very much. If we may, we'll go ahead and start jumping in the chat box questions. So part of determining the licensing status, I think that is part of the question we have here. One of them, how many of those studies, we talked about the FERC licensing studies, would need to be, or do we estimate would need to be updated because of new information or changing conditions? But really that's what we would need to determine, because this has been frankly, it's gone a little bit stale. It's been 5 or 6 years since we had real active work on this project, correct?
Correct. That is correct. It has been 5 or 6 years. And that is one of the things that we have to determine is what studies need to be updated. And we're anticipating that the balance of it will be about $100 million that will be needed to update all the different and present it to FERC to get to FERC licensing. And the state has, like I said, the state has already invested close to $200 million towards licensing already.
So really we got about a third of the way there, $200 million in. We were 2/3 along the way, and we've got about a third of both the work and the cost to go to bringing it to potentially to licensure.
Correct.
Okay. Do you have any, there are opponents to any large project, or really anything you might try to do, any one of us. How are we as far as discussions of known concerns with dam opponents?
Again, we have not had conversations with anybody on this, is because it has not been green lighted by the governor or the legislature on next steps. We've had people testify in support and oppose it at some of our board meetings, but it's not an agenda item, because right now we don't have a budget or anything to complete these studies. We're still in conversations, like I said, with the administration, with the legislature, in providing information and education of what is the next step and do they wish to pursue it. That's really a policy call.
Okay. This is an interesting one. Is the proposed financing and COPA still based on assumption, COPA being cost of power analysis, based on the assumption of a 50% state grant? What is that 6 cents that you mentioned? Yeah, under what financing terms was that based?
Just
This is Brian, and I believe when that was done back around 2014, that 6 cents was based on what was then called the Bradley model, where the state would be contributing in on terms of similar to what Bradley was done. The state would put in 50% of the initial construction cost, and then once that was, so that would help reduce the initial cost down for consumers. And then once the initial bonds were paid off, then the funds would go back to the state through a excess payments type of thing there. So the state would get a return on its money at some point in the future, but in the shorter term period, the consumers and the utilities would have a lower cost of energy.
So put another way, again, my understanding of the Bradley Lake model was using a bit of state grant to reduce the initial borrowing necessity and the cost of that borrowed money, but then with an attenuated payback, essentially turning what had been a 30-year, say a 30-year bond into essentially a 6-year low interest loan, helping to get the project going, reducing the cost of power over time.
Yeah, that would be correct. And just to kind of where we are with Bradley right now is they are in the last year of paying the bonds. The bonds will be paid off in June of 2021, or literally within the next 4 months after 30 years. But as long as there's debt on Bradley, and that being the Bradley Lake Diversion Project, then there will be continued excess payments, which is basically the amount of the bond payment, which is about $12.5 million that will be continued to be paid to the state for the next 29 years, which is what the current debt left is on Bradley from the most recent improvements. And the utilities, that's according to the power sales agreement, that's what we continue to do. Ironically, just a little tidbit is, even though that is the agreement and it's in statute, nobody took into account how to actually make that mechanism work, where they actually deposited to the state that $12.5 million. And so we're working with the utility, we're working with the governor's office and the legislature to actually being able to receive that money and deposit it into the state's general fund.
Okay. We'll tell you that when we were having initial discussions, and it really was among this group, about the Interior Energy Project and how that might get funded, we did look to the Bradley Lake model as an example of the benefits of how a blended finance package could both help a project move forward, but also under some return to the state that made funds available potentially for future projects. We do have a question, so we have some environmental questions. So are we factoring climate change in the way we're kind of looking at this project, specifically, shrinking glaciers in the Alaska range, the water source, and how climate change might impact both the current, but more importantly into the future, the quote unquote fuel, which is the water for this project?
From the standpoint of water flows for Susitna and the amount of energy it generates, the climate change, if anything, may be a positive. And the reason why it is, as the air is warmer, it can hold more moisture. And so as it holds more moisture, several areas of Alaska will tend to get more precip. So certainly we are seeing that with Bradley. The energy output from Bradley has been increasing during the last 10, 20 years. And with the warmer air, it's going to be bringing more moisture into the interior area, the drainage basin for Susitna. So there's, it should increase the amount of energy from Susitna, if anything.
So again, what sounds like what we're saying is that decreases in melt from deglaciation will be balanced by increased precipitation.
Yes, and the increases in melt from the glaciers in the short term, and I'm saying 50 years, in 50 years, the glacier melt will actually be higher as they first melt. But once the glaciers have been melted back to a new stable part or otherwise, certainly the moisture in the area, you've got a basin of, it's more than 6,000 square miles. And the moisture in the basin is actually still going to be the predominant, both now and in the future, water coming down for the Susitna project. And so you will have more water in the future from rainfall.
Okay. Folks may be coming off of mute to talk about this a little bit more. But for now, again, I'll just go to the last question we currently have remaining in the chat box. If I remember correctly, does the federal government still consider hydro a non-renewable resource?
Yes, that is true.
Can anyone speak to that more fully?
I think it varies a little bit with the federal government in terms of what program or agency wise. And so some of the ones do and some don't. And so that's, one thing to remember though is hydro is a combination of solar and wind. Both of those are renewable, and hydro is just a case of the solar warming up water somewhere and the wind moving it to deposit it elsewhere. And so I guess I mentally think of it, as long as the wind blows and the sun shines, hydro will be a renewable resource.
Interesting. Ooh, the questions keep popping up. Regarding the cost estimate for the dam, again, to fully utilize the power, of course, there were going to need to be connections, upgrades to the transmission systems. And my recollection is that those costs were not actually built in to the dam cost. Is that correct? And so again, if we're talking about, say, a $5.5 billion project, there are, outside of that are still some of the upgrades that would need to happen to really utilize that power by moving it around. Is that correct?
Yes, the cost estimate has it for transmission to the points, the nearest interconnection point. So there'd be transmission of 2 sets of 230 lines that run across right around Gold Creek, and 1 set that would head north towards Cantwell. And where they connect in with the existing intertie is where the cost estimate stops.
And our final question currently in the chat box regards slides 14 and 15, which I believe these were, yes, regarding FERC licensing. Am I correct in remembering that the most difficult studies are essentially complete, and that the remaining are kind of cleanup studies, and that FERC saw no showstoppers ahead, at least at that time?
I don't know if it would necessarily I won't say that the most difficult ones are completed. To that point where there has been no showstoppers, and data has been collected, be it fisheries or otherwise, and so those are issues, but none of them those ones are not completed. But there hasn't been any type of showstoppers, and at this point, FERC has been agreeing certainly with the way the studies have been moving forward and not going for changes in the way the studies are.
Okay. So I guess one of the big overarching questions, one of the impetuses for the request for presentation was the amount of investment necessary to start moving this forward again. And moving it essentially to a place where we can make further decisions regarding go ahead or go or no go. So really about $100 million. At least that's our current estimate on that end of the process. Is that fair?
Yeah, that is fair. That's what we anticipated to be is about the $100 million mark. And that's the one. If we have the FERC license in hand, that's the game changer in who develops the dam. That could be a project at the state. That could be a private-public partnership. That could be a private entity that comes in and does it. But we first need that FERC license so we can really decide what that next phase looks like on how we actually construct it. A lot of things have changed in the marketplace, I think, in the last 6 years. Obviously, the price of oil has dropped 140 down to, I think it's $70 a day. So those numbers change, and there's different players in the spectrum of energy now too, with the price of money so low, that might change it. And like I said, we've had interest from American companies as well as international companies at looking at the opportunity of Susitna-Watana. And so I think those conversations will grow greatly once we have a FERC license in hand.
You mentioned the vicissitudes of the energy market, and really, again, we seem to get diverted often off of long-term strategic projects based on very short-term variations and other factors, and often to our detriment. Certainly here in the interior, when the price of energy really spiked with the cost of oil, we really would have wished, say in the 80s, we had moved forward on a project like this. We do have a question. Yes, if anyone has a question, please feel free to take yourself off of mute so I don't have to do a hatchet job reading your questions.
Yeah, this is Lisa, if I can jump in here.
Yes, please, miss.
Yeah, this is, I was going to try to type it, but it's harder to type it. But I wonder if in redoing cost benefit analysis and if this would fall within the purview of what you're doing. But I can't help but wonder if, the state has already spent a tremendous amount of money on this. It's $100 million to get just to licensing, and then, billions beyond that. And has there been any consideration of putting that money, even, the 100 million or some percentage of it, into actually weatherization and energy efficiency and energy conservation along the rail belt and elsewhere in Alaska? And and looking at the sort of balancing act of that, if homes and businesses were more energy efficient, as they really ought to be, would that offset the need for this dam?
That's kind of a politically loaded question. I think a couple things is the state has spent hundreds of millions of dollars towards energy efficiency. 10 years ago, you could qualify up to $10,000 per home to do energy efficiency on your home. At that time, I was working in the private sector for a gas utility, and it did make a difference. But the overall arching is, do we need the power, and do we need do we want to go to a renewable power source? The one thing that we're all faced with is the fact of the cost of natural gas in Cook Inlet continues to rise. We have one company that is exploring Cook Inlet. And so our next question is do we, and this is just an overall question. I'm not saying this is pro or con, but pretty soon, Alaska or South Central, including Fairbanks, is going to be faced, do we want to import natural gas, LNG, to produce our power, or do we want to go renewable? And that's really more of a policy question that again, the governor, the legislature, and communities need to have. I don't want to say that we've reached our maximum capacity for energy efficiency, but Alaska Housing Corporation, I can't remember, but it was well over $100 million that they spent on winterization programs across the state with success, but it doesn't solve the problem of growing power. One thing also that brings Susitna-Watana is if it's 450 to 600 megawatts, you have additional power to bring in additional businesses into Alaska, some sort of industrial complex or something like that, that will bring jobs into the economy and grow the Alaska economy and diversify it. And that's a side benefit of a project like this. But again, those are conversations we all need to have to figure out if this is the right project at the right time.
So my recollection is the last time we took the state took a very serious look at this project. It was both. Again, it was at the same time that AHFC, the state, was making substantial investments in retrofits and energy efficiency. And I don't want to speak for you, Ms. Lisa, but I think you probably agree, and I think most of us would agree. In a perfect world, it wouldn't be an either or; it would be both.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
Okay.
Yeah.
We do have one final.
Joe,
Oh,
Joe, if I might,
yes,
I
Mr.
was
Newman.
trying to compare this to some of the other options that we have, and I think what's critically needed in the rail belt is an updated integrated resource plan that would presumably be done under the auspices of the Rail Belt Reliability Council that's trying to get formed up. And sometimes it's the chicken before the egg or the egg before the chicken, and that's sort of a problem. And I'm trying to look at that timeline, and I'm trying to look at some of the other options that we have. We've talked about a different couple of pumped hydro options, and trying to figure out really what is going to lead us into the future with the rail belt. And I don't know, maybe Curtis and your group could just talk briefly about some of that process.
Well, first of all, I don't disagree on the need, and we have been pushing internally the need to update a resource plan or integrated plan for the rail belt. The last one was done about 10 years ago. And we've had those conversations with utilities, and there is some funding that we have that is actually designated for some other projects that are not moving forward. So we are working internally to find out if we could use that money for that purpose, because I think we'll all benefit from it, and that will answer a lot of questions of what our needs are. We look to Bradley just because it's an operating hydro project, but we see opportunities there to increase the energy and the efficiency of that dam going forward. A couple of them happens to do with climate change. There's some glaciers that have receded that has water flowing from them, that if we could do like we did with Battle Creek and divert that water into Bradley Lake, that's going to help Bradley Lake's project, or Bradley Lake Hydro. So with that, we continue to look at small projects and things that will move the needle, and we look at these larger ones. But again, without an integrated resource plan that's 10 years old, we are kind of shooting in the dark to a certain degree.
well, we have passed the top of the hour. Thank you very much, Mr. Thayer, Brian. Do we have any final questions, or is there any final statement you'd like to make?
As far as I would like to thank you, everybody, on behalf of AEA for allowing us to present. And again, if there's anything that we can do or provide additional information or answer questions, we have a complete staff of engineers and subject matter experts that we're more than willing to do. And as this project or any major project advances, we might like to come before you and have another discussion as there's milestones that are met on various things.
All right. Mr. Wilkin, I see you've come off of mute.
Oh, yeah, thank you, Jomo. I was just going to briefly suggest that this would be an excellent effort on behalf of FEDCO to package this up and start to re-engage in supporting this wonderful project. And so I'll just offer that for you and Jim and others to think about. Thank you for the presentation. It's nice to see Curtis. And I should let people know that Brian
Thank you,
Carey
sir.
has forgotten more than any of us will ever know about Susitna. So he is definitely a touchstone, and I say that in all seriousness. Thank you for what you've done, Brian. Thanks, Joe.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, thank you very much. All right. Again, excellent presentation. Thank you very, very much for the update on this project. Regarding FEDCO, we started looking at this in more earnest way back at the early onset of this task force, which actually started as the Fairbanks Cost of Energy Task Force way back in, I want to say, 2006. And coming through that discussion in, say, the 2006-2007 timeframe is when we kind of really started encouraging the state to take another look at this project and others along that vein. And some of the things that, not to toot too many of our own horns, but good old Steve Hagginson was the chair of that committee. Some of the things that did come out of that advocacy was a refreshed look at the Susitna project, encouragement for what became AHFC's AEA's renewable grant program, as well as AHFC's home energy retrofit and rebate program. So yes, thank you, Mr. Wilkin. I think we will be helping to take a more close look at this and maybe help moving it forward. All right, everybody. Well, that's all I got. Let's see. Right now, I don't really have a presentation lined up for next week, but of course, as always, I'll be scrapping around. So we'll keep you advised. Beyond that, again, thank you very much, Executive Director Thayer. Thank you, Brian. Thank everybody at AEA for your amazing work. We'll be keeping an eye on the things that you have on the legislative agenda. If you have anything that you would like us to take a closer look at for possible support, please do let us know. Beyond that, I hope everybody up here in the interior is enjoying the warmer weather and that everyone has a great week. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you.